Hi, I'm ChristoNel. I'm a visiting lecturer at the University of Stellenbosch Business School. And for the past few years, under the auspices of Project Hope at University of Stellenbosch, I've been conducting research into what is required to address the urgency of socio-political transformation and justice, both at a macro societal level, but also within organizations, and more specifically within the private sector. What I'll be spending a bit of time on is to look at a particular area of concern in the South African environment, and that is the fact that since 1994, when we went through our quite immense political transformation, we have not seemingly made the same progress on the social and economic fronts. The necessity in successful societies for a symbiosis between government and the role of government, which essentially is to be able to create the socio-economic policy umbrella under which real sustainable economic growth can take place. And then the role of business, where the role of business is to be able to create a sustainable job-creating environment which creates hope and aspiration. It's those three entities that came together that has created really a minor miracle in the East-West German unification, and specifically in Berlin. We are now sitting at a deeper crisis point than we did in the late 1980s. If economic liberation does not come for a large part of our citizens in this lifetime, then frankly we will be eroding the tenacity of our democracy. If the members of that society do not have a shared view of history, then they will not be able to create a shared view of the future. And this is why we selected a basket of qualitative processes, is to create and to generate viable alternatives to the status quo. Number one, exploring the context. And here we use the combination of narrative learning as well as appreciative inquiry. And we involve these people in small group dialogue, sometimes in larger rooms of up to 250 people at a time, but in small group dialogue, and generating through them what is the context, what are the challenges, what do we have to do about this challenge facing the country. So firstly, let's co-create the future, let's understand the context. Secondly, is to consolidate the information. And then finally, let's test the status. So what are the realities? The Denner-King scenarios show the fact that 40% of our society still lives in abject poverty. The great entrepreneur Anton Rupert wrote and said that we cannot sleep comfortably if our neighbors are hungry. 50% of the youth between 20 to 24 being unemployed. One of the problems that has occurred since 1994, sad as it sounds, is that our education system has become schizophrenic. If we look at the progress in hard numbers on employment equity in the private sector, this is comparing 2006 to 2010. You have the economically active population down the right-hand side, and at top management, 11.3 to 2.7% representativity of African black, 4.7 to 4.6 of colored. And so we can go through it. At a senior management level, so generally sort of general management, senior middle management, not significantly much progress. So 11, 12%, 13, 17%. At a skilled technical level, yeah, we're seeing much more progress. Still quite low, but we're seeing the progress. And in professional qualified, we're starting to see it as well. What are the micro realities? Here I'm looking at organizations. One of the conclusions that came out is if we get the numbers right, and we don't fundamentally change the culture of our institutions, then all that we would have done is replace a white-driven autocracy with a black-driven autocracy. And I think it's time for us to start being that crude about it. Saying, guys, we're not making it. Why not? How are we going to do it? So a lot of the research has been into clearly articulating the question. The old society value shift, which is still pretty much the dominant one, tends to be rooted in these views that communism lost, capitalism won, that market, and this is a very crucial thing, that market economics is equated with consumerism. Government, insofar as that in the run-up to the 94 elections, one of the things that we need to recognize with the ANC is when they arrived at the negotiations, they were incredibly well prepared from a political standpoint. They were economically and organizationally naive. And so we ended up with economic policy which is better suited to England than it is to a society without extraordinary splits. The new society, clearly, capitalism did not win. Communism merely lost first. True markets have to be equated to society and community. And then a very crucial one is that business has to be fit and friendly for human life. What are the type of old society values versus the new society values? Then in 2003 and 2008, we again replicated the research, looking essentially at old society on the left-hand side and new society on the right-hand side. And again, you can see that the balancing factor is not significant progress. And then since 2010, we involved close to 1,700 people at executive levels. We conducted focus groups at operational levels. We worked with senior management, change leader groups, and middle management. Where do they see the organizations? On the left-hand side, old society, on the right-hand side, new society. The picture is quite clear. So when we then go and we look at 1984, 85 with Project Free Enterprise, and we look now at this research and we plot it, we've made huge progress. In discovering and looking at the problem and trying to define it, what the research is doing for us is starting to allow certain answers to emerge. Up until 94, at local government and national government level, you found a rich engagement across the barriers between government and business. And then came 94, and for very, very obvious reasons, mistrust, just not knowing one another, those connections were totally missed. Pervasive Afro-pessimism, a non-belief in the reality that Africa has changed. Generally speaking, business in South Africa has done pretty well. But if we look at it, there hasn't been adequate provision and investment in development of people skills, development of management, development of alternative investment. Instead, we're being flooded with shopping malls, petrol stations, office blocks, which are at the low end of value add and don't create high value jobs. Deeply flawed, BBBEE, lack-based economic empowerment. The economic empowerment side of it has in general failed. The so-called economically active population against which the DTI measures, we can't find any statistical data which tells you what is the economically viable population. The current, and I'm all for employment equity, we can't get away with it, without it. But it's a blunt instrument at the moment. And I'm just stunned by businesses' passivity in this. And I'm stunned by our statistical services that aren't separating it out. And then the drivers of transformation, leadership, and competitiveness, the culture drivers. There's a lack of competence. There's a lack of understanding at managerial levels. So as we looked at it, we looked at some of the field work, and we said, let's look at the realities of transformation. Peter Senge from MIT makes this lovely statement: to be a leader and executive is to be ignorant and incompetent. The imagery that came out of many of these dialogue groups and consolidated was this beautiful imagery of a washing machine. And that as people go from the old to the new, they get stuck, needless to say, in a place of incompetence. As we now went and backwards looked at change, both that has failed and succeeded, we saw that the companies were going through these phases of unconscious incompetence. Then they go into very conceptual on the what and why. And then they start, if they're lucky, they start looking at the how. But there, when people have to define the how, then there's an emotional and intellectual reticence. Slowly you start getting emergent insights, mandates in success stories start appearing, there's a necessity for compliance, and then you get the emergent sanctions, the emergent successes, and entrenching the practice. Now, taking this and just putting it on a vertical and working with people, we see that the change trajectory actually looks something like that. And it goes through some very, very classic phases. First one, early pressure, and then you have this high-level agreement. Then you start getting a couple of early adopters. You get mandated execution plans, and then only does it really start becoming a flywheel of success. Pervasive leadership presence. The CEO and executives are present. They are continuously creating the umbrella for specialists and line managers to drive it. There's a very strong basic trust, and they drive 90-day execution cycles, and they build capacity. And in a very crucial thing, they celebrate and they censure management. The reasons for failure is low executive presence. Finally, some dynamics, mutually reinforcing polarities. A typical polarity would be productivity versus higher wages. The violence of language and deeds and the violence of silence and apathy. If the silence and apathy persists, the language of violence and deeds will persist. Then the next one, laissez-faire economic policies and exploitative capitalism. Because the reality is, if you've got a society which since '94 has got more unequal, has shed more jobs than it's created, and is deindustrializing, that's exploitative. On the other hand, we've got fragmented and very cautious government policy. Our nation is not using the wealth of the nation to make the nation wealthy. Then I've mentioned already legalistic BBBEE and mechanical compliance versus a reliance on market forces and incremental evolution. So on the one hand, we've got DTI pressurizing legalistic BBBEE. On the other hand, you've got a business environment which is saying, no, you've got to be more incremental, we've got to rely on market forces. We have to get to a sustainable culture. Then a very vital one that came out, and this was something that grew out of these 1,700 people, somehow this notion of owning our common African identity is going to be very crucial in this. And a final one that I want to focus on is the black mobility and frustration and white fears and trepidation. It's impossible for us to really understand where we come from. I can't understand what it is to carry the burden of having been black in the South African environment. I can't. And on the other hand, it's very often difficult for me to understand why a white should be filled with fear and trepidation. So the same enemies that fought the war must create the future. In conclusion, we need to find the steps, the formulas for a facilitative, assertive government. Government must start accepting we're a developed, underdeveloped, and developing society all in one. Activist business leadership. It is not on for business leadership, and yeah, I'm talking about the CEOs. It's not on for them to delegate and abdicate decision-making to disempowered people sitting in organized industry bodies. I'm not saying they don't have a role to play, but without the activist business leadership, they are hamstrung. The whole notion of strategic unionism versus militant unionism. And unions starting to understand that there's a huge part of collaboration that has to take place. Finally, conscious citizenship. Here, I think we need to look at countries like Switzerland, Israel, others, where the notion, for instance, of post-school development force versus defense force. The post-graduation plowback internship year, not just for medical doctors, but for engineers, teachers. We've got to start building that type of involvement. The intention is to cascade these findings through existing institutions. So thank you very much.